Okay, I said I was going to do 2 videos to cover the nervous system. Turns out there's so much information that I'm going to split it up even more. So this video is just on the central nervous system. So we organize our nervous system into central and peripheral. So central is referring to the brain and the spinal cord, and peripheral nervous system is everything else. The peripheral nervous system is further organized into the somatic nervous system, which is voluntary, and the autonomic nervous system, which is involuntarily. So, for example, if I walk, that's my somatic nervous system, but if I digest my food, that is the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is further divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Sympathetic nervous system is fight or flight response kind of things, so diverting blood to the skeletal muscle and away from digestive system, for example, is a sympathetic nervous system response. Also, like dilation of pupils, that's sympathetic nervous system, but we can talk more about that when we get to peripheral nervous system. For now, we are going to focus on the central nervous system, and we're going to start by looking at what's actually in the central nervous system. And we talked at length about neurons in the neuron structure and function video, but there's actually also a wide diversity of these cells called glia that are supportive cells that help out the neurons to do various things and to stay alive in the brain. So there's a couple different kinds of these. One of them is called an ependymal cell, and these guys basically they're going to have little cilia that move around the cerebrospinal fluid, which is the stuff that the brain and spinal cord sit in. And there's also astrocytes. Astrocytes have a whole lot of functions, but they kind of help out the neurons with information transfer. They help them they help form the blood-brain barrier, which is super important in protecting the brain against infections. They help make sure that the extracellular fluid contains the right stuff. There's also microglia, which are immune cells for the brain. There's oligodendrocytes, which we talked a bit about when we talked about myelin sheaths. They make myelin sheaths for the central nervous system. In the peripheral nervous system, I want to mention that there's also myelin sheath-making cells. Those are called Schwann cells, and that's why we need more than just neurons. We need all these glia to help support our brain and the rest of our nervous system. So what's actually in the brain? Well, we categorize it into a few different areas, and these areas develop from being pretty simple to being more complicated. So it starts out in an embryo with the process of neurulation, and that's the process of forming this thing called a nerve tube, or a neural tube. And this tube will become the brain, and it will become the spinal cord. And as this tube grows, it gets divided into a forebrain, a midbrain, and hindbrain. And then we got some really complicated names. The forebrain divides into the telencephalon and diencephalon. The midbrain becomes the mesencephalon, and the hindbrain becomes the metencephalon and the myelencephalon. And these are going to grow into adult structures called the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. So if we take a quick look at the brain here, we can see the 3 major areas. The cerebrum is going to be all of our voluntary thinking and advanced functions. The cerebellum, all you have to know about that is that it helps you coordinate movements along with these other structures called the basal ganglia. They also help with that, and they're in the cerebrum, but it's mainly the cerebellum that coordinates movements. And then the brainstem does a bunch of really, really basic functions. So like heart rate, breathing, all the stuff that you can do when you're in a coma, brainstem. So in the respiratory system, you might remember that the brainstem receives that signal of the acidity of the cerebrospinal fluid, and that's how it helps regulate your breathing without you even realizing it. If we look at the cerebral cortex, which is the outer part of the cerebrum, it's divided up into lobes. So there's the frontal lobe at the front, the parietal lobe at the top, the temporal lobe, which is near your temples, and the occipital lobe. The occiput is what like the back of your head is called. So the frontal lobe is going to do like your executive functioning, which is like it kind of controls everything else. and this is where you can plan and organize and make important choices. This also notably has something called Broca's area, and Broca's area is it was discovered by this French guy, Pierre Broca, and anybody who doesn't have it is going to have a hard time forming words. Or anybody not doesn't have it, but like if it got damaged or something. There's also going to be some motor activity controlled by the frontal lobe, but this is voluntary motor activity, whereas the cerebellum does like coordination. So like if you get off balance, that's your cerebellum, but if you want to walk your dog, that's the frontal lobe. In the parietal lobe, you have a lot to do with somatosensation, and somatosensation is basically, do I know where I am? Do I know like where my arm is with respect to my foot? If I close my eyes, can I touch my nose? Type of things. The temporal lobe is going to be important for processing auditory information. So I remember this because, and I'll go over this when I go over the peripheral nervous system and sensation. Your ear has got this membrane called the tympanic membrane, and that kind of sounds like temporal lobe. So that's how I remember that one. The occipital lobe has visual processing. So you can think occipital, ocular. Oh, I also wanted to mention that in the temporal lobe, there is this area called Wernicke's area, and that has to do with language comprehension. So if you have an injury in your Wernicke's area, you might not be able to understand what people are saying, but you might still be able to talk. There's also this set of places in your brain known as the limbic system, and the limbic system has to do with emotion and memory. So the hippocampus is important in memory. There's also the thalamus. The thalamus is a sensory relay station. So basically anything before it goes to those places in the cerebral cortex, like the temporal lobe or the occipital lobe, information from your sensory organs is going to pass through the thalamus, and the thalamus is going to kind of direct it to where it needs to go. There's also the hypothalamus, which is below the thalamus, as the name suggests, and that's like a clock / thermostat / general homeostatic regulator for the body. So if you're trying to decide whether to go to sleep, the hypothalamus is going to control like your biological clock and say, okay, you've been awake for this amount of time, now you have to go to sleep. It also controls your temperature. So say you're having an immune response and you need to get rid of a pathogen, it's going to set your thermostat on high and give you a fever and try to get rid of the pathogen. There's also the amygdala. Amygdala is big in the sympathetic nervous system response, or fight or flight response, and that's what you need to know about the structures of the brain.